Protagonist once believed that even someone like him, whose talents had awakened, blossomed, and taken root on the battlefield, could begin a new life. In that new life, he hoped to create a family, something he had desperately yearned for. But he was mistaken. On the battlefield, someone remarked on his tenacity, saying it had been a long time since anyone had made him swing his sword more than 10 times. Our protagonist Argrick was kneeling, bleeding on the ground, when his enemy asked if he was the famed Argrick, the talent that had blossomed in war. He didn't respond at first, realizing his enemy knew exactly who he was, and to his surprise, he felt a strange happiness. Laughing, he told his enemy it was an honor to be recognized and called him Duke Thermion. Thermion asked if he knew his name. Argrick replied that he did, acknowledging that Thermion was one of the 6 Hexa-class knights of the Althian Empire. He added that a single day on the battlefield was more than enough to feel the weight of the Black Wave. Thermion, realizing Argrick had chosen to face him despite knowing his identity, remarked that it would be a shame to end such a talent prematurely. He then asked if Argrick had any intention of surrendering. After a brief pause, Argrick gripped his sword, pulling it from the ground and raised it high, declaring that he was born on the battlefield, and there he would die. Argrick stood, swung his sword, causing a strong gust of wind, trying to intimidate Thermion, but Thermion merely stared back, unfazed. The gust of wind sends the destroyed objects flying, yet Thermion calmly noted that despite his words, regret lingered in Argrick's eyes. He remarked that Argrick would have made a worthy rival if given more time to grow. Thermion then released his own aura, moving his sword as he declared that if this was what Argrick wished, he would grant it. Charging toward Argrick, he expressed a hope that in the next life, Argrick could let go of his regrets. As Thermion's sword came down, Argrick stood calmly, waiting for the attack. With his one remaining hand, he summoned all his strength to block each of Thermion's relentless strikes. The war between the Dranic Empire and the Althian Empire had lasted for many years. Argrick's mother, a young widow and refugee, had left him alone in a chaotic world when she took her final breath. Argrick knew the fate of war orphans, and in his youth, he joined the knights, training for war. His life became one of survival, doing anything and everything necessary to live. When he turned 14, he was sent to his first battlefield. Driven by his determination to survive, he won decisively, and there his talents awakened. The Monore in his heart heightened his movements and senses to an extraordinary level. Years later, Argrick became a commander of the Dranic Empire's war knights. The higher-ups informed him that they planned to recommend him for the upcoming special knight appointment. They explained that, with his talent, joining the ranks of the 5 Hexa-class knights of the Empire wouldn't be impossible. He smiled, thinking that after surpassing 3 Monores and becoming a quad-core knight, he had finally acquired the opportunity he had long desired. He believed that, after this war, he might finally find peace from his weary life. He fought determinedly against the enemy, and just as he was about to achieve everything, Thermion appeared. With a single swing of his sword, Thermion easily severed one of Argrick's arms. Thermion silently stared at him before slashing again. Argrick managed to block the blow, but Thermion was too powerful. After only blocking a few strikes, Argrick's sword shattered into pieces, and he couldn't help but think it was a shame, as he had wanted to reach greater heights. Eventually, Thermion drove his sword into Argrick's chest, causing him to scream in pain, his thoughts turning to the family he had hoped to create. The force of the blow lifted him off the ground, and with the shattered earth beneath him, he was flung away. As he lost consciousness and was dragged across the battlefield, his dreams were pitifully crushed. Argrick thought it would end there, but when he opened his eyes, he saw lights and heard a sweet woman's voice asking if their little Dane was finally awake. He heard the woman commenting on how clear and beautiful his eyes were and felt her hands holding his. The woman remarked that she was certain her child was a gift from the gods, to which the man agreed, replying that he was indeed a gift from the divine. Panicking, Argrick questioned what they were talking about. Then, the man, Arkan Sagars, lifted him up and affectionately called him Dane, telling him he must become a fantastic spearman, following in his father's footsteps. But before Arkan could continue, a woman, his mother Lily Sagars, interrupted loudly, grabbing him and insisting that Dane would become a fantastic assassin. Arkin asked Lily how she could plan to turn their youngest son into an assassin, saying it would be horrifying. He argued that a man should wield a spear, calling it the most beautiful and complete martial art. Lily, angry, retorted that an assassin was better than a spearman and that Dane could stealthily hide in the shadows, eliminating his targets without being detected, which was much cooler. Argrick, now Dane, realized he had not died on the battlefield as he expected. Instead, he had reincarnated, and not only that, he was reborn in the Althaean Empire, the enemy nation, as the youngest son of a noble family. His new parents eventually agreed to teach him both spearmanship and assassination skills, but he noticed that they were constantly in a heated debate about his future. It seemed to him that, since he was born in their later years, they were particularly eager for him to follow in their footsteps. Later, the driver informed Arkin that they had arrived, surprising him. Arkin told Lily to take his hand, but she worriedly asked what would happen if the castle members saw them. Arkin laughed and replied that he was merely trying to hold his wife's hand, asking her why it would matter. Dane watched his parents caring for each other with affection and thought it was a touching sight, but when he looked forward, he was shocked to see a huge, beautiful castle. As they entered, Lily remarked that Arkin seemed happy to be home, noticing the smile on his face. Arkin agreed, thinking that in such a house it might be easier for Dane's talents to flourish than he had originally imagined. 2 months later, Dane was in his room when Lily picked him up after hearing him babble. This made him realize that he was indeed babbling, a new experience for both him and those around him. He recalled that he had rarely encountered young children during his time on the battlefield. The few he did meet were wrapped in bandages, crying because they had nowhere to go. Many children wept for their parents as they slowly succumbed to starvation, fading away. Compared to those scenes, the saga's household was a place of fortune and wealth, meaning he wouldn't have to worry about starving here. Suddenly, the door to his room burst open, and Arkin excitedly entered, urging him to look at what he had brought. Stamping a long piece of wood on the floor, Arkin proudly announced that it was a spear. He then eagerly asked Dane how he liked it, boasting that it was long and beautiful. Lily placed Dane back into his crib, while he internally acknowledged that Arkin, despite his enthusiastic demeanor, was the strongest Hexa-class spearman in the Empire and a war hero known as the Blue Whirlwind. Lily, however, was furious. She asked Arkin how he could bring something so sharp into a child's room. Arkin explained that he just wanted to show it to Dane, but Lily reminded him that she had clearly said no early education. She also pointed out that she had been the best assassin in the Empire. She warned Arkin that if he continued, she would start teaching Dane the basics of stealth while he was still young. Dane noted that her raised voice was louder than one would expect from an assassin. Arkin calmly responded that everyone was doing it these days, mentioning that the teleport placed a staff beside a newborn as soon as they were born. Lily angrily asked him if a spear was the same as a staff, reminding him that spears were sharp weapons. Dane sighed, thinking about how harmonious their family was despite these arguments. Dane realized that the reason his parents were so concerned about his future was because his 2 elder sisters had chosen careers unrelated to either spearmanship or assassination. Later, his sisters visited him. One of them, Arabella Saugers, playfully used her wind magic, making his cheeks puff up. Dane protested, but all that came out was babbling. Dane knew that Arabella, due to her talent in magic, had been on the path of a mage since she was young. At 12 years old, she was already a 3-chain class mage, which was a significant achievement since the highest rank for a mage was 9-chain. Arabella asked if he would like to learn magic with her later, as she found it boring to study alone every day. His other sister, Clare Saugers, chimed in, suggesting that summoning was also a good path. Dane knew that Clare was a talented summoner. She had succeeded in her first summon at the age of 7 and could now control 2 summons simultaneously. Arabella urged Clare to touch him, saying he was incredibly soft. Clare hesitated for a moment, and Dane, observing her, tried to convince her mentally. He initially thought she didn't like him, but he realized it was more of the jealousy older siblings sometimes feel when a younger one arrives. She seemed less wary of him now than before. Clare finally touched his nose and, with excitement, asked Arabella how he could be so soft. Arabella agreed enthusiastically. Clare touched him again, remarking that it might be fun if he turned out to be talented in summoning too, and offered to teach him later. Dane awkwardly laughed, realizing that everyone wanted to teach him their specialty. He then glanced at the family portrait. His father was a renowned hexaclass spearman, his mother a former assassin who had once attempted to assassinate the emperor, his eldest sister a genius mage, and his other elder sister a skilled summoner. Smiling, he thought that House Saugers was the perfect noble family and the ideal family he had always imagined. He then asked himself if there was any meaning to seeking revenge in his new life. Although his death had been regretful, he knew that the battlefield was a place of conflict, and it seemed almost laughable to think about taking revenge on someone who had defeated him fair and square. He gazed at his family, who were arguing about his future, and smiled. He had always longed for a family, and now he felt grateful to have been born into this one. Watching his father, mother, and sisters arguing with one another made him hesitate. He wondered if he was right in thinking that this was what a harmonious family looked like. In House Saugers, there exists a special ceremony called the choosing ceremony. When a child born into the family turns 1, various objects are placed on a table before them, and the family tries to predict the child's future based on the object they choose. Months later, his first birthday arrived, and everyone was bustling about, preparing for the celebration. The nobles were eager to see what Dane would choose, given that his elder sisters had chosen the paths of a mage and a summoner. Everyone knew the answer would be revealed at the choosing ceremony. A moment later, inside the mansion's party hall, the room filled with guests, and Dane sat with his family at the table. In front of him were several objects, including different weapons. The nobles noticed that his older sisters had brought their own items and found it endearing. Lily gently reminded him that he just needed to choose the one he liked. Dane sighed, glancing around and wondering what he should do, knowing that everyone was eagerly waiting for him to pick the object they had placed. His father, Archon, thought to himself that Dane would probably be drawn to the dragontail spear, a weapon with a spearhead made from the rare ore Dukaran. When imbued with mana, it became as sharp and heavy as the mana put into it, making it a mystical magic spear. Archon, who had spent his life with this weapon, hoped Dane would choose it. His mother, Lily, believed that Dane was too handsome to be an assassin, but she was convinced he would still select the dagger known as Nighthorn. Crafted from the ore ethereal, the dagger could hold all elemental powers and store various poisons. Arabella, his older sister, thought Dane would become a great mage and hoped he would follow her to the academy in the future. She had placed a subspace pouch on the table, an object that only mages or those with magical talent could use. Clare, his other sister, believed that if Dane had summoning potential, she could take him flying on her summon, Dekaran, fulfilling her dream. She placed a summoner's sign on the table, a symbol summoners use to receive a code based on their talent and summon creatures. Dane looked around, suddenly feeling as if he could hear their thoughts. He sighed again, realizing how troublesome this situation was, but he knew he couldn't avoid it. He placed his hands on the table, preparing himself while wondering which object to take. The nobles stopped what they were doing, watching him in anticipation. As he crawled toward the items, he observed the crowd's reactions, considering his decision carefully. Archon, excited, urged him to choose something long and sturdy, while Lily suggested that the short, sharp object was prettier. Arabella reminded him that the pouch was her favorite, and Clare, stuttering slightly, asked him to pick the summoner's sign so they could summon together. Dane felt the pressure building. As he moved closer to the objects, he was shocked when all of them suddenly lit up at once. He stared in disbelief at the glowing items, wondering what was happening. Lily, panicked, asked Archon what was going on, but he admitted he had no idea. Dane's older sisters called his name worriedly. The nobles, astonished by the sight, whispered among themselves, unable to comprehend how every object had reacted to him. They began to speculate that their young master must be a generational genius. Dane looked at the items, laughing inwardly. He had been talented in war, but it seemed his new life was on an entirely different level. Arabella, concerned, asked Archon what they should do, and if something like this had ever happened before. Archon, still in disbelief, responded that he could hardly believe it himself. He and Lily exchanged a look, silently agreeing on a decision. Archon then asked his daughters if they should teach Dane all 4 disciplines, leaving his sisters in shock. They couldn't believe what they were hearing, but Dane simply laughed, satisfied with the result. Years later, at the training ground, Dane was practicing hard but was momentarily pushed backward. However, he quickly composed himself and stood firm in front of his father. Archon praised him, saying that he had perfectly polished the technique he had been taught. Now 6 years old, Dane thanked his father for the compliment. Archon, with pride, patted his head and said that he had expected nothing less since Dane was his son. Just then, someone approached them. Dane looked over and saw it was their butler, Herman. Herman respectfully reported to Archon that he had brought the item. Archon acknowledged him and replied that his timing was perfect. He then took the weapon from Herman, telling Dane that it was his birthday present. Archon explained that he had originally planned to give it to him during his birthday banquet, but he wanted to give it to him early, before his mother had the chance. Archon handed Dane the weapon and mentioned that it had been in preparation for 2 years, specially commissioned from a renowned craftsman in the capital. Dane was amazed as he examined the gift, feeling touched when his father warmly wished him a happy 7th birthday in advance. He immediately dropped his wooden spear and took the new one, thanking his father and swearing that he would use it well. As he inspected the spear, he noticed the sleek black handle and the silver spearhead, marveling at how amazing they looked together. He was also surprised by how light the weapon felt in his hands. Archon asked if he liked it, and Dane enthusiastically replied that he loved it. Archon smiled and told him that the spear had been adjusted to fit his physique, so he should get accustomed to using it. Excited, Dane swung the new spear around, making Archon smile before calling his name more seriously as he reached for his own spear nearby. Archon asked Dane if he remembered the difference between a sword and a spear. Dane answered confidently, explaining that the spear's length allows them to keep their opponents at a distance, and its narrow contact area makes it highly efficient in attack. Archon confirmed that he was correct. As Herman bowed and excused himself to leave, Archon continued, telling Dane that at a certain level, the spear becomes more difficult to use than a sword, which is the fundamental challenge of the weapon. He explained that a spear requires a minimum distance to attack effectively, but every weapon has its strengths and weaknesses. Even swords, which are often called perfect weapons, become vulnerable in certain situations. Dane nodded, assuring his father that he would keep this in mind. Archon then picked up his spear, rolling it effortlessly in his hands, and told Dane that since he had received a new weapon, he would show him something impressive. Dane watched in awe as Archon demonstrated the immense magical power of a Hexa-class spearman. The very energy Archon emitted was overwhelming. Archon closed his eyes to focus, took a proper stance, and channeled mana into his spear. When he thrust it into the air, a powerful explosion of energy erupted, distorting the space around them. Dane was amazed, realizing that his father's trust in his spear allowed him to easily break through the space barrier. Archon explained that the distortion in space occurred because he emitted his magic power at the same moment he thrust the spear, utilizing a technique that harnessed the core's ability to concentrate magic power in one place. Dane nodded in agreement, recalling that his sisters had once mentioned that humans could push their physical abilities beyond their limits. He also remembered that as the number of cores increased, so did those limits, making him reflect on how, in his past life, he had reached the level of a quad-core knight. Archon praised Dane for studying well, and proudly told him that he now had 6 mana cores. Dane could hardly believe it, and thought to himself that if he hadn't died in his past life, he might have achieved the same. Archon then softly placed a hand on his shoulder, asking him to give his new spear a try, to which Dane eagerly agreed. Archon instructed him to relax his mind, forget everything else, and focus solely on thrusting the spear. Dane confidently replied, yes. As Dane positioned himself, he remembered that in his past life he hadn't had much interest in spears. After discovering his talent for swordsmanship, he had only used a spear as a secondary weapon. Determined to give it his best effort, he closed his eyes and focused. Archon, observing him, noticed that Dane had naturally adopted a good stance. Archon knew that it had taken him 7 years to master the technique, and he wondered if Dane could follow the same path. Suddenly, the space barrier shattered, leaving Archon in shock. He couldn't believe that Dane had succeeded on his first attempt. He saw the spearhead pierce the space barrier and, in disbelief, shouted, asking how Dane had done it. Approaching him, Archon told him he was impressed, Dane explained that at the moment he thrust the spear, he gathered magic power in one place, imbued it into the spearhead, and then, just as the magic reached the spearhead, he cut off the flow. Archon was astonished and asked if Dane had truly imbued magic power into the spear and then stopped the flow, forming a monocore in the process. Dane confirmed this and explained that while reading a book about creating monocores, he had tried it himself and, by luck, succeeded. In truth, however, he had formed the core while practicing mana breathing. Archon couldn't believe that Dane had formed a monocore simply by reading a book, and, filled with pride, shouted that a genius had been born into their house. He told Dane that he had sensed his talent from a young age, but now he was certain of it. Archon predicted that Dane would become an extraordinary warrior, to which Dane smiled, thinking that there would be more surprises in store for his father. Archon, laughing proudly, mused to himself if his son would truly become a mage spearman assassin summoner. A few days later, on Dane Saga's 7th birthday, the party hall was filled with nobles who had gathered to celebrate. Everyone seemed to be enjoying the event when Duke Thermion approached Archon, laughing, and asked how long it had been since they last met. Archon recognized Thermion and asked how he had been. Thermion waved off the formalities, saying there was no need for such formal talk between them. Archon dashed to Thermion's side and whispered that many people were watching, and that he would relax the formalities later. Thermion told him to do as he pleased, and asked if he knew where the boy was. Archon called for Dane, asking him to come over and greet Duke Thermion. The moment Dane saw Thermion, he remembered how the man had defeated and killed him in his past life. Despite this, Dane followed his father's request. Thermion asked Archon if this was the son he had praised so much. Dane introduced himself respectfully, though he couldn't help but feel anger bubbling inside. Nonetheless, he gracefully told Thermion that it was an honor to meet him. Thermion, pleased with the interaction, shouted to Archon that he had a dependable son, and that it seemed he had nothing to worry about. Thermion then asked Archon if Dane was learning the spear, just like his father. Archon confirmed this. Just then, a girl approached them, and Dane was startled when he saw her. The girl greeted Archon gracefully and introduced herself as Layla Thermion, the youngest daughter of the Thermion Duchy. A moment later, the guests were dancing and chatting happily while the musicians played lively music. As everyone enjoyed themselves, Archon asked Thermion how the Baroness was doing. Thermion replied that they were trying every possible method but had yet to make any progress. Archon, concerned, told Thermion that he was going through quite an ordeal, but he was confident that the Baroness would get better. Thermion responded that if he suddenly disappeared, Archon should understand that it meant he had used a scroll to return quickly to the capital. He then asked where Dane had gone. Thermion mentioned that Dane seemed like a witty child and that he wanted to speak with him a little more. Archon agreed, saying he also wondered where Dane was and noted that Layla was nowhere to be seen either. Thermion then spotted Dane and Layla outside in the garden and remarked that it seemed the party was boring for the two children. Meanwhile, outside in the garden, Layla told Dane that although she didn't like following her father everywhere, she was glad she had come to this party with him. She thought to herself that he looked even more handsome under the moonlight. Dane replied that he was glad to hear it, adding that their territory was a nice, peaceful place. Layla agreed but shared that in there was always something happening. Nobles visited daily to bow to her father, and even members of the imperial family occasionally appeared. Whenever that happened, she had to greet them in a dress, which she hated as she much preferred wearing simple clothes and swinging a sword. Dane guessed that she must be skilled with a sword. She then asked what he enjoyed, and he replied that he liked both peaceful days and spear training. He mentioned that while their territory wasn't as lively as the capital, he looked forward to spear training the most. Layla, remembering Arcan's nickname, the Blue Whirlwind, told him that her father had often spoken about how incredible Arcan was. She then asked if Dane was also aiming for admittance into the academy. Dane replied no, explaining that he wasn't training with the spear just to get into the academy, which surprised her. She asked why not, as training for academy admission seemed like the obvious goal. He awkwardly explained that while he was training hard, his primary goal wasn't solely to join the academy. This confused her, and she asked what he would do if he failed to enroll. Dane replied that if he failed, he'd simply try again, and if he continued to fail, he would accept that the academy wasn't his path. Layla expressed disbelief, asking if he wasn't afraid of disappointing his family. Dane calmly replied that he wasn't. She admitted she was jealous of him, explaining that failure wasn't an option in her household, but quickly begged him to forget what she had just said. Dane sighed, realizing that even nobles had their own worries. He asked why she thought like that, especially when it seemed she would do just fine. This excited Layla, and she asked him if he would take a look at her swordsmanship. Surprised, Dane asked if she really wanted him to watch her swordsmanship. She excitedly replied yes, and seeing her enthusiasm, he agreed to watch for a bit. Layla then asked where the training ground was, and Dane told her to follow him, wondering if it would be fine for just a moment. A moment later, at the training ground, Layla swung her sword around skillfully, easily slicing through the air and even slashing the wall. She turned while swinging her sword smoothly, attacking and defending with precision. Dane was impressed, noting how seamlessly she transitioned between offensive and defensive movements. Her timing was excellent, but after a while, she began to go slightly offbeat. After finishing her display, Layla, stuttering a bit, asked how she had done. Dane told her that it was fantastic and a delight to watch, which made her excited as she asked if he really meant it. He awkwardly smiled, wondering if he should point out her mistake. Deciding to do so, he explained that starting from her third form, she seemed to be taking half a step more than needed. Reflecting on her earlier forms, he added that this extra step caused her later movements to feel slightly misaligned. Layla was stunned in surprise at his observation. He noticed Layla's reaction and wondered if he had been a bit too blunt. Apologizing, he told her he didn't mean to upset her, and explained that it had been a while since he had seen swordsmanship. Before he could finish, Layla swung her sword forward, shouting, "Okay." She continued, saying that it was what it was, and that his observation was the missing piece of the puzzle she had been searching for. As she thrust her sword forward again, she tripped and fell on him, hugging him in the process. Layla thanked him, but Dane, flustered, stammered as he asked her what she was doing. She leaned her cheek against his and excitedly told him he had a real eye for swordsmanship. She couldn't believe he had instantly spotted what she had been doing wrong for so long. Gratefully, she thanked him again, saying she would remember his advice. Dane, feeling suffocated, pushed her away, exclaiming that she was squeezing him too hard and asked her to put the sword away. Layla quickly did so, apologizing as she hid the sword behind her back, all the while smiling at him. Dane adjusted his coat, thinking that her sudden hug had caught him off guard. Just then, they heard people calling their names in concern, wondering where they were. Layla mentioned that it seemed people were looking for them, and Dane agreed that they should head back. After straightening themselves out, they left the training ground, where the searchers immediately spotted them. When they returned to the banquet, Dane's parents warmly congratulated him on his 7th birthday and on his first Mont Accord. His mother handed him her gift. He thanked his parents and opened the present, surprised to find a brooch with their family crest, much like the ones his sisters often showed off. Lily told him to treasure it, explaining that the brooch now served as a symbol of his status and honor within the family. The nobles began clapping, congratulating him on his birthday, and cheerfully shouting that he had truly earned the name of Saugers. They remarked that he would grow up to be a fine man like his father. Dane's parents smiled sweetly at him, filling him with warmth and love. It was the first time he had ever received such heartfelt applause from so many people. Suddenly, the entire mansion shook, and a loud rumble from outside caused everyone to panic. Guests began to ask frantically if it was an enemy invasion. Dane turned to his father in worry, but Arkan calmly told him there was nothing to fret over, looking up as he remarked that it was happening again, even though he had hoped for a quiet day. His mother, equally composed, asked if Arkan had a guess as to who it might be. Arkan sighed as he figured it out. Just then, the ceiling crackled with thunder magic, and a portal opened, filling the room with bright light. The nobles screamed in fear and panic, shouting in confusion as they wondered what was happening. But then, a figure emerged from the portal, spinning in midair before landing gracefully on the floor. She casually asked if anyone could check the time, then asked if she was right that her big sister wasn't late. The nobles, stunned, whispered among themselves, realizing that it was Arabella. They couldn't believe she had used teleportation magic, knowing that opening even a small gate required at least 5 chain magic ability. Everyone marveled at Arabella's genius, but Dane, irritated, just thought she was being loud and flashy as usual. Suddenly, another shock hit the nobles as they screamed in horror while looking out the window. In the sky, a large wyvern was flying, and they quickly realized that Clare was riding it. Clare looked down, remarking that she was just a step too late. She entered the banquet hall and walked to the center, with the nobles whispering in awe about how they had heard Clare was a genius summoner, but couldn't believe she was capable of controlling a wyvern at just 16 years old. Arabella greeted Clare, asking if she had arrived. Clare replied that she had, and the two sisters finally turned to Dane, sweetly wishing him a happy birthday together.